thank you so much for joining us today to explore what a justice-centered approach to carbon removal might look like in Europe and beyond. I'm Kayla Cohen. I'm a senior researcher at Carbon Gap, and I'll be moderating today's panel. Before we get stuck into it, I'll just let you know what to expect. Firstly, there's going to be a half-hour thereabout of a moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll go into question and answers with the audience in the room, so please do think about which questions you'd like to ask. And I believe that today's session will be recorded as well and put on YouTube. Okay, so I think that as perhaps the attendance in the room testifies, this is a topic that is not only doesn't get enough airtime in kind of civic discourse, but also political discourse. It's a topic that really is incredibly complex, very pressing, and there's not enough interest in it. So I'm really excited that Carbon Gap has the capacity to be a convener in this space and to platform difficult conversations, but ones that we need to be engaging with now. I'll also mention that today's discussion will be summarized by Rachel Ardiff from Oxford Net Zero. Thank you so much for joining us today. And reported back to the conference after the break. It's imperative that Europe starts to engage with, at the policy level, the social and the ethical dimensions of carbon removal systematically and rigorously. And today we've got a panel that can speak to both the theoretical dimensions of justice and the practical implications of how does that play out on the ground by companies and within communities. So to introduce the panel, we've got Dr. Wim Carton from Lund University, senior lecturer there. Dr. Emily Cox, who is a lead author on the CDR, State of CDR report, and also a researcher at the University of Oxford, Cardiff University, and Core Greenhouse Gas Removals Hub in the UK. And we have Bella Corpora from the Carbon Business Council, an associate director there, and also a research fellow, I believe, at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. And Tafadzwa DuToit Nyamande, who joins us all the way from Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for making the very long journey. And Tafadzwa is the head of operations at Carbon Connect Africa, which is a biochar business. So let's start with you, Wim. Your work is rooted in climate justice. Yes, do make sure that the microphones work. Your work on carbon removal is rooted in climate justice, and I'm wondering, what do you think are the most pressing questions at the intersection of climate justice and carbon removal today?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. As you say, it's a really important topic and one that I think warrants much more attention. So I think there's a lot of kind of ground to cover when we talk about climate justice and CDR. And I'm going to speak, I guess, on a kind of more global level, not so much, directed specifically at what's happening or should happen in the EU, but I think obviously this is relevant to the EU as well. So I think the obvious starting point is the kind of distributional justice question. If we talk about CDR projects, then there's a clear kind of question in terms of where are those going to be located, right? With land-based CDR, the question becomes whose land are we going to use, who's going to benefit from this, who's going to pay for it. With things like DAC or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the siting becomes a very important question, right? The moment you have any kind of possible negative side effects, then where these, in which communities are these projects going to be sited becomes a clear question to be looked at. But I would actually say that the most important, or not most important, but the kind of most neglected question in this space, and also maybe the ones that your report doesn't fully cover, is really the use side of this, right? What are we going to use CDR for? And I think this is a question of residual emissions. It's essentially who's going to be able to claim these carbon removals to compensate for their emissions. At the moment, we're in a situation where this is basically left to the market because, you know, so much of this governance is emerging through the market at the moment, which essentially means that you have a situation where residual emissions are being defined by the willingness to pay and the ability to pay. And I think that raises some key questions because it means that, you know, it's going to be the likes of Bill Gates that are able to pay for, you know, high durability carbon removal, and maybe not the people in places where they need to compensate for residual emissions from agriculture, from, you know, rice paddy farming, for example. So I think who is going to use carbon removal and to compensate what is really, I think, the kind of one of the, I would say, justice frontiers in this discussion. And obviously this relates to the question of mitigation deterrence in the sense that I think there's more and more recognition that CDR should be seen as a limited resource, at least when we think of it in terms of their sustainability limits in terms of how much CDR we can responsibly deploy. There's always going to be side effects. There's going to be demand on land, on energy, on other resources. So there's going to be a limited capacity of doing that in a sustainable way that doesn't compromise on other uses of those resources, right, or on biodiversity. And that means essentially that you have a limited pool of CDR to allocate. So it's an allocation question. Who has the right to use that CDR, essentially? And if we use it to compensate for emissions that aren't truly residual, then I think, you know, which is the situation we're in at the moment, and I think we're creating injustices. There's other questions as well. I'm going to be very brief, but essentially, it's, you know, historically we've seen a tendency with carbon offsetting projects to outsource burdens to the global south. I think there's a clear risk with that as well that we should be mindful of. I think there's a risk that we prioritize scaling CDR quickly, and that justice becomes this kind of an afterthought. There's a very strong focus now on how to do this as quickly as possible and how to have as much CDR as possible. And I think justice is just not part of the whole conversation. It usually comes at the end as something that we have to kind of correct, right? So there's a risk there. And then finally, there's, I would say, almost an ideological commitment to cost effectiveness in this whole conversation, right? There's so much focus on we need to have the cheapest CDR, we need to kind of find the lowest cost opportunities. I mean, if you're concerned about justice and responsibility and labor cost and environmental integrity, you don't go to Foot Locker and buy the cheapest shoes on offer, right? You have to be willing to spend money to, you know, fund responsible CDR. And I think that means that we have to move away from this kind of commitment to funding this through markets, because markets are by definition, you know, well suited to lowering costs, but they're very, very ill suited, I think, to scaling responsible forms of CDR. So I think there's a clear need for other forms of mechanisms to do this. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. I know it's difficult to be brief on this topic, but thanks for summarising at the high level. Some of the key questions, hopefully we'll go deeper into them during this panel. Emily, your research focuses on public perceptions of different carbon removal methods and in different kind of contexts, as well as ways that we can think about how to ensure responsible deployment. So I am wondering what you think the link between public participation in climate innovation and ethical development of new technologies is. And perhaps just from a citizen's point of view, what would just carbon removal look like?
Yeah, great, thank you. So, I mean, in practice, I spend the majority of my time asking people, asking the general public, asking specific communities, how they feel about particular proposals for carbon removal. And then we dig into this data to try and understand more about why people might respond in particular ways, and to understand how we might actually do CDR in ways that are more in line with public preferences. So at its most basic, our response to the justice challenge is usually to try and kind of open up to more diverse viewpoints, right? Those viewpoints could be those who are otherwise marginalised from discussions. They could be people who are directly affected by a project, for example. They could be people who are going to end up paying for CDR, for instance, via their taxes. And we know from decades of experience in other sectors that we get a lot of benefits when we open up the conversation in this way. So in one respect, participation can be important to improve buy-in to decisions, right? And I often hear the phrase, oh, well, it's really important that we bring the public along with us. And yeah, okay, that's important, but it's definitely not the whole of the picture. And we need to be really cautious about using this work simply as a tool to get our own way, essentially. We need to leave space to enable publics to actually change our minds, to help us make better decisions. We see publics as a crucial source of knowledge, a crucial way to improve, make more ethical and effective policies and technologies. And so to do carbon removal in a just way, we need to kind of approach the question from a bottom-up perspective of what might be socially desirable, what might be socially robust, which is slightly different from the sort of conventional way of figuring out what is technologically feasible and then kind of trying to work backwards from there, right? So on the second part of your question, from a climate justice perspective, we can think about some key tenets of justice, right? And Wim's already talked about the really crucial distribution aspect, you know, how the costs and benefits are distributed. A lot of what we do focuses on kind of procedural aspects. So this is how the procedures get done, how decisions get made. But then there's also a crucial recognition aspect, right? So this is whose voice even counts. If you're doing a procedure, who even gets to be in the room? And I think that in our work on opening up to these diverse perspectives, we have a real tendency to kind of prioritize the procedural aspects. Partly because as researchers, this is the easiest aspect for us to control, right? And so we kind of assume that by including more diverse voices, we'll end up with more just CDR. But of course, actually doing it is a lot more difficult in practice. There are all kinds of embedded power dynamics that we need to be aware of. We come to the piece with power as researchers. Also, within any community, there are power dynamics. There are some who have more voice than others. Really importantly, there are also power dynamics in who gets to decide what happens next. And so one of the things we have to avoid is what we call like pseudo-voice, which is basically asking people for a say on decisions that they actually feel have kind of already been made. This is really common in a lot of consultation processes. It's also really common if we look at the history of project failure, right? Because of this, one of the biggest challenges we consistently face is actually acting on what we find from public deliberation work. It can be very challenging for projects to change course once they're already set in motion and once we understand enough about the potential social and environmental risks. Our work's trying to tackle this in a number of ways, and I'm not going to go into detail about all of these things, but please feel free to ask me questions in the coffee break about these different projects. And so, for example, we've been using public deliberation processes to help us design a framework of principles for evaluating CDR projects so that we can actually evaluate them on things which matter to the public. We've been working with communities at field trial sites to understand what are the most important questions that we should actually be prioritising for the next phases of field research. And we've also been working to develop a system for including public views in decisions about how funding gets allocated. We've been trialling this with a very small kind of pilot stage funding program, which we manage, but obviously we're hoping to kind of scale up this process to larger funding decisions. Watch this space, and I'll finish there.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting and very innovative research. I'm also wondering if those water bottles are obfuscating your faces. So perhaps pour the water as you wish, and then I'll take them away. Thank you. Bella, so as Associate Director at the Carbon Business Council, you work with, well, it is a non-profit coalition of, I believe, over 100 carbon management companies. And you've been at the forefront of some of the work that you've been doing to produce resources around training for responsible deployment within carbon management, of which carbon removal is a part. So I'm wondering, what do you hope will be the effect of these resources within the industry? And also just more broadly, like, what do you think is the role of industry in ensuring that deployment does happen in an ethical way?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you so much for having me here today. Hello, everyone. I'm Bella Corpora. I'm an Associate Director of the Carbon Business Council, like Kayla was saying. We are a nonprofit trade association that operates out of Washington, D.C., focusing on carbon removal and carbon management. And within that, we do have 100 companies from around the world. And I see other trade associations in here today. And so definitely, I think there is a lot more to be said about the role of industry. And so to start out with the kind of trainings that we have been doing, we do have a pillar within our affiliation of responsible deployment. So there's two components that we've designed so far. One is called the Ethical Oath to Restore the Earth. It's essentially like a 2-minute read, but it discusses how we should have twin targets, so emissions reductions in tandem with carbon management. In addition to that, we've created a suite of resources called the Responsible Deployment Trainings. This is an online suite of resources ranging from over 200 different publications that we've put together in a document for availability as a resource, but we've also built out a 1.5-hour online training. This itself is a little bit more oriented towards project developers, but is open to the public for a lot of people who are interested in learning about carbon removal, and with that, how to responsibly deploy. So that looks like an 8-segment online training. We do have videos. We convened an advisory board that was composed of environmental justice experts, ranging from things like Carbon 180 to the National Wildlife Federation, Elemental Accelerator, and others in the field. And so essentially, a certification is generated once you've completed the training. You learn a lot about different types of justice, like Wim was discussing earlier, as well as how to go about doing things like creating a community benefits plan and a community benefits agreement. I know today we're talking a little bit more about justice in regards to like the EU and EU policy, but at the United States level, I'm from the States myself, we really had a lot of policy mechanisms that are impactful into why these things are starting to be designed. So under the Biden administration, there was an executive order to form the Justice 40 initiative. So essentially 40% of benefits that are created by a project need to go back to disadvantaged and marginalized communities. For any project developer that's looking to receive funding from the US Department of Energy under this initiative, essentially has to abide by that. So there's a lot that has started to be developed with companies applying for funding and things like that with community benefit plans. But it's like, how do you go about creating these? The Department of Energy Online has a community benefit agreement toolkit, but the plan is a lot more robust. It's not just interacting with communities, but also lining out how you're going to have different components of your project actually like go back to those who you are working with. And so I think later we'll talk about different mechanisms that are like common policy potentially. But within that, I think my kind of takeaway for like industry is that like project developers don't have to do this alone. For a lot of them, like it's really hard, I think, to navigate the policy landscape. While being an earlier stage company, maybe you don't necessarily have the resources to know about how to engage with communities. You're starting to think about it. You have an idea that you've formulated. You're starting to get funding for it. But like, what does that actually mean to go engage with others? And then I think on top of it, you know, a lot of what we talk about at the association with responsible deployment is not just community engagement, but also the importance of things like robust monitoring, reporting, verification. So we see ourselves as, at least for the moment, helping to fill a gap. Like I said, if there's not a toolkit out there for creating a community benefits plan and things like that, these resources are there to help project developers and, of course, like the wider community start to learning about this subject. Lastly, I think these areas together also help to level the playing field. There really is so much still to be done, I think, with bringing industry up, and I recognize a lot about the need for speed as we talk about the climate crisis, but also how do we do it in a way where we are actually having a town hall if we're going to start engaging with the community where, okay, maybe we're going to do an ocean solution, or how do you bring about translators to make sure that you are actually engaging with the community you're deploying in. So I will leave it at that, Kayla. Thank you, and I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Bella. Tafadzwa, we've heard a lot about the distributive justice dimension at the global level, and I'd be really interested in learning about your experience at the local level on the ground, or even the national level in Zimbabwe. You have been instrumental in bringing biochar business to Zimbabwe. I know there's a long way to go, but I'd be really keen to understand, why were you keen on bringing biochar to Zimbabwe, and what are some of the impacts that you're already seeing on through the projects on the communities or the people who are working on it? Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. My name is Tafadzwa DuToit Nyamande. I work with Carbon Connect in Zimbabwe. We are a project developer doing biochar carbon removal. So we work in partnership with a company that processes baobab shells. And these baobab shells are processed centrally, but they are collected by wild fruit collectors. These wild fruit collectors are villagers, and they just go into the wild. Of course, they follow certain rules so that they don't exhaust the fruit trees. They collect those fruits, then they take them to the processing center where they get paid, and the shells, the baobab fruits are then processed centrally. So over time, the shells were heaping up, and after a while, they'll get burnt, and this has been going on for some years. So now we no longer have to burn those shells because we're now converting them to biochar. Some of these wild fruit collectors are also farmers who are trained by also one of our partners who trains them on how to farm organically. And their produce is then exported to Europe. So the biochar that we make is helping them to improve the soil quality. In fact, I would say the areas where baobab thrives are very arid areas where there's low rainfall. It's very hot. It's probably one of the areas that are most affected by climate change. So the biochar helps their soils to get better so that they can have better yields of the produce that's then exported to Europe. So talking about the keenness, it was just through observing what is happening. Firstly, the baobab shells or husks, obviously the piles, when they are burnt, they emit a lot of, they produce a lot of emissions. If they are left there, they will also produce a lot of methane emissions. So our intervention helps to reduce those emissions. So and given that the area is a very poor area where people really, really don't have any other choice, most of them are unemployed, so this makes a big impact on them. Talking of impact, when we train these farmers, or when we train the artisanal producers, we're also bringing climate awareness to them. Issues, sometimes they don't understand why is it now different, why has it become so hot? Why don't we have normal rains like we used to have? So we try to get them to understand where they fit into the whole into the bigger picture of climate change. We are also obviously providing employment to the artisans who are on the ground making the biochar. By the way, we're not using any high-tech methods to make the biochar. We're using flame curtain pyrolysis or Kontiki type of pyrolysis. And I also mentioned that the area is very arid, it's very dry. We are sort of trying to improve the productivity of their soils. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. So, there's no shortage of questions to ask you all, but I've given some thought to certain cross-cutting questions that I would like two of your perspectives on at a time, if that's all right, before we go into question and answers with the audience. Tafadzwa and Wim, I'd love to get your view on what you think the role of Europe should be in ensuring that CDR deployment results in globally fair outcomes. You've both talked about distributive justice at different scales, but obviously, Tafadzwa, you're coming from Zimbabwe, where there's quite big governance gaps within the EU policy around how will the benefits and the burdens be distributed beyond Europe. So it would be great to get your view on that, and Wim likewise.
Sure, that is very critical. That when we're looking at the EU, we're looking at an advanced economy as compared to where we're coming from. Africa as a whole, or the global South, obviously bears the brunt of the industrialization that has gotten this part of the world to be where it is. Yet we remain least resilient, and this is not just in theory, we see this every day. I think that the role of Europe should be to kind of put forward policies that ensure that when a company from here, for example, wants to develop a project down south or in Africa or in our country, they don't just go and do it there and take all the money back to Europe or all the benefits back to Europe. We want to see that these people who are least resilient are actually benefiting. For example, we're talking about carbon credits, right? This is money that comes from a certificate that's being sold because someone did the work down there. We don't want to see these people as just beneficiaries, but project co-creators. And in that sense, they should also get at least a portion, a decent portion of the amount of money that's being sold for, that a certificate is sold for. We are also looking at an opportunity to sort of correct some of these historical things that have been happening, where companies come and then I don't want to use that word, but we can say loot. If you take something and someone is left with nothing, that's looting, right? So this is an opportunity to change that trend, to set a different, and we're looking at CDR stretching for the next 20, 30 years at least, right? And within those years, if done right, we can actually see people's lives changing. I'm talking about if you're going to have a meal and that meal costs $10, to someone, that $10 can take their kid to school for 6 weeks, for example. So we're talking about not too much, but we can do something that's different from what's been done before.
Thank you, Tafadzwa. Wim?
I'll be very brief. So I agree. Key here, I think some of the projects that we have seen in the past in terms of the Kyoto Protocol, for example, and the Clean Development Mechanism, were these kind of foreign companies coming in and themselves doing, and the benefits did not stay locally and then were exported to Europe. I think local ownership is obviously key, right? So the kind of projects that you're doing, I think, are an example of how one can really kind of keep the benefits of, I mean, both the project itself, but then also the revenues from, carbon credits and so on within the country. I mean, I would also say there's been in the discussion we had before, right, there's this idea that, we have this portfolio of CDR methods, and there's, an opportunity for broadening, and we should look at all of them, and obviously that's valuable, and we should explore all of them. At some point, I think, if we take justice seriously, we should also considering narrowing down our portfolio. I think there's some methods that are just, from a justice perspective, more undesirable than others. And I'm thinking of the kind of plantation-style afforestation projects, for example, that have dominated carbon forestry and carbon offsetting projects in the past, that we see often come with clear negative environmental and social implications, especially when it's, large corporate actors driving these projects. The alternative, of course, is agroforestry, or much more small scale, much more embedded in local needs and environments. So I think really thinking carefully about what kind of projects we do when we look outside of Europe and specific to the global south is essential.
Thank you. And if I may have a quick follow-up with you, Wim. There is some thinking around carbon removal being a kind of squarely fitting within the framework of climate reparations. I'm wondering where you sit on that view.
This is a very big question, actually. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, maybe, to the idea of climate reparations, but at the same time, I mean, first of all, we haven't even peaked emissions yet globally, so to talk of climate reparations, I think, risks becoming a distraction if we start talking about these things that we need to do in 2070 or something. Well, there's so much we need to do now in terms of preventing harm in the first place. And I think the analogy with where climate reparations come from originally, when we talk of colonialism and slavery, doesn't fully hold up because of this kind of temporal aspect. Essentially, we're going to emit a lot more before anyone ever is going to, at the global level, go negative. The main maybe point is also that there's so much in the climate system that you just cannot repair. You can reduce global temperatures again by carbon removal. But sea level rise and ice sheet loss and the potential weakening or breakdown of the Atlantic Ocean currents, all the climate damages that happen between now and the time when we finally get to net zero, all those things cannot be reversed. So in that sense, it's a very kind of imperfect form of climate reparation. And then finally, we're talking about, if we want to go back to pre-industrial levels, what a lot of people talk about when they talk about climate reparation. We're talking about 2,000 gigatons of carbon. I think one shouldn't be naive about the industrial scale of removals that would be necessary to do that, and the implications on land and resources and so on. So you don't want climate reparations to come with an unreasonable environmental cost either. So obviously, from a justice perspective, climate reparations sounds very good, but I think one has to really look very carefully about what that means.
Thank you so much. Sorry for throwing you in the deep end, but you handled that with grace. Emily and Bella, just to summarize as well, I think that was quite a powerful call for the EU to be thinking about a distributive justice kind of approach at the global level, and maybe, not to put words in anyone's mouth, but Justice 40 works at a national level in the US. What would the equivalent be in Europe, which is globally facing? That's an open question to the Commission. Emily and Bella, I'm interested, there are many different CDR methods, and community engagement will surely differ from project to project. But in your experience, are there any rules of thumb around what good community engagement practices look like for CDR projects?
Yeah, sure. So, In one respect, this is a really difficult question to answer, right? Because the context really, really matters. And not only each community, but also each national context, each jurisdiction will be different and will have different histories that they need to take into account, right? I guess at its most basic, one rule of thumb could be like, understand the context, do some desk-based research, and do not underestimate the importance of local collaboration, right? But I think kind of also taking a step back from that, I think that something that could be really beneficial at multiple scales, but including at a national level, is to have a bit of a more systematic approach to public engagement. Because at the moment, it's incredibly ad hoc, right? We've got some project developers doing it. We've got some project developers not bothering. I'm sure that there are plenty who are really taking on board Bella's training programs, and there are also probably some who are not. And of course, the risk with this is that it risks only one project getting it badly wrong. We showed in a 2023 paper on what we called perception spillover that the controversy around fracking, which basically stemmed from a lot of projects not taking engagement and not taking the public seriously, that controversy has spilled over to negatively impact perceptions on a whole range of energy technologies, including carbon capture and storage, right? And so we really need to try and systematize this a little bit better. Something that we've been arguing for a while is to consider the potential of citizens' assemblies, which have shown great promise, especially in situations of quite high polarization of opinions, and to think about maybe citizens' assemblies at multiple kind of nested scales so that you're capturing the local levels and the regional levels, but also these kind of larger national levels.
That was great. A lot of these values, too, we had worked with our advisory committee towards our responsible deployment training. And I would say, like, in addition to these pillars, I think that aspect of, like, continuous engagement is really important and perhaps not as talked about as often as it could. You know, it's one thing to go to a community and have a discussion with them, but if you're not doing so over time as your project is being started, as it is growing, maybe, you know, 10 years down the process, like having that continuous engagement, reflection, and then like feedback from the community is really key. I would say too, amplifying essentially what Emily was saying, is just being like critically aware of the community that you are interacting with. The United States has had a big history of carbon management, and many issues that have come with that. So a lot of the purpose behind Justice 40 is in recognition of this. And so those 40% of benefits are targeted towards specifically like disadvantaged and marginalized communities in recognition of this. So there's like an additional impact of like sensitivity with that. And so a lot of it too is like listening as to why, you know, maybe because of other historical injustices that have occurred, communities may be less willing to have a project deployed in their local community. So it's like even more like taking the time to have these discussions.
Thank you. I think perhaps it would be nice to take some questions from the audience. Great. I think we'll take 3 and then whoever would like to field them or do make it explicit who you'd like to ask.
Good morning. David Morrison, representing the Moore Scientific Centre and Conservation International. I have questions for all of you, but I'll leave that for afterwards. Instead, I'm going to throw up a straw man, because first of all, I think this is a fantastic panel, and I love how you have these overlapping expertises, but from different areas coming together. So with that in mind, I'd love to get your opinion on this, and if it's too big, we can talk afterwards. CDR, carbon, some people are throwing it about as being an export opportunity for developing states. The idea being you have high quality, durable carbon dioxide removal, whether it be from biochar or rotational grazing or mangrove restoration. And then under Article 6, that could be an export commodity, whether that be through legislation in country to make sure the benefits stay there, or things like export taxes, which we already see with other commodities. So I'm throwing that out there to everyone on the panel because I'd like to hear why that's a bad idea. Because I can say for myself why it's a great idea, but I'd love to take the opportunity of all your expertise here to hear what the problems could be with that.
Hi, I'm Alex from Accent. We are a carbon development company based in Norway, operating on the VCM. Indeed, I wanted to thank you all for this panel. I think it's a very important question. The fact that the room is not as full as the one downstairs shows also how important it is to bring this forward, and it is still something that needs to come more to the forefront, but I'm very glad that Carbon Gap put this event together. I actually have two questions, but feel free to pick which one you prefer answering. But you partly addressed the difference in terms of like how prone to justice certain methods are. Compared to others. We have someone representing the biochar industry now, and we know how much it's prone to ticking lots of SDG boxes in terms of livelihoods for farmers, in terms of food security, etc. So I'm curious about your take on the various methods and how prone they are to justice. And also curious, how do you think we can take learnings from the renewable industry, how they managed to bring community power within the industry, how the learnings basically from what renewables did in terms of justice and community engagement and involvement. Thank you.
Is there another question?
Thank you. This is probably a question more for Wim, but also anyone else on the panel. You mentioned that there is a tension between justice-centered projects and cost effectiveness, and that perhaps market mechanisms won't be sufficient to kind of address that issue. I was wondering if you had any suggestions for alternative mechanisms to support more justice-centered projects.
Thank you. Okay, so across those questions, we've got the what are the potential negatives around Article 6 and the idea of exporting CDR from developing countries. Then we've got CDR methods by justice. Can it be ranked? And learnings from renewable energy, and then alternative mechanisms to market. Wim, perhaps you can take the last. Who would like to start? Thank you.
I'll take the first question about why CDR could be a bad idea. Well, I'll sort of repeat what I've mentioned, but I want to give an example of what happened in Zimbabwe. There was a project, I'm sure you've heard about this case, about the Kariba Red Plus project, where a company, a big company, I will not mention the name, managed to generate quite a significant amount of credits from a project which was based in Kariba. Yeah, but in Kariba, they are obviously natives, owners of the land, people who relied on the forest to get their food, maybe to hunt, or they coexist with this forest. And then suddenly they were not able to access this forest because it was now protected. And later on you hear that a certain company has earned $300 million plus from this. The people have no idea why they can't access this area anymore. They were not engaged, if I may say. So it can be a bad idea if it's not properly monitored or regulated. And this, fortunately, I've got this example. We don't want it to happen to other countries. Well, the government of Zimbabwe did then respond by stopping all carbon credit-related projects. You know, even the people who were doing it the right way were stopped. And from then onwards, a piece of legislation was put forward, and everything was under one umbrella. You know, and it was a bit hard for certain types of projects. You know, the fees were high, the taxes were high. Almost like 50% of the credit money was supposed to be then, the government would then decide what to do with that which is obviously not good for anyone who wants to develop a project. So I'd say it could be a bad idea when not done right.
Thank you.
I think I'll touch upon a few. The question in the back on renewable energy was really interesting. In 2022, there was a paper that came out on how, it was in tandem with Data for Progress in the United States, how only 13% of renewable projects were polled to actually be successful if they had proper, robust community engagement. And so I think 13%, at the time was a fairly low number. And it affirms how, as we're in this moment for carbon removal of building it up, truly that need for robust engagement in order to be success and to help generate that social license to operate. I think part of this could come from having a method neutral and criteria based approach. When talking about technologies, we are a tech neutral trade association, so I'm not sure I can fully answer the question in the back, but having rigorous and robust monitoring, reporting, verification in tandem with other components for equity. I think a lot right now actually those are separated, and there's been conversations about how we can either incorporate that into MRV or have it be kind of a flagship component. And I think right now MRV stands as one opportunity for making sure that projects are credible, as well as serving their climate purpose. And I think having truly a more robust equity component will be key. I will say too, in regards to the question of other forms of justice, incorporations, at the government level in places like the US, there is the Responsible Carbon Management Initiative that is coming likely later this year. That already is a government initiative that is talking about how to have robust community engagement and things like that for carbon removal projects. We have seen the world's first direct procurement by a government entity, and I think direct procurement itself stands differently from having a market-based approach. So perhaps there with justice considerations within a more governance-oriented regime stands as a different type of opportunity than what has, at least was discussed in the earlier panel in this room on market-based approaches. And then I would say too, there are areas for somewhat governments that come in the voluntary carbon market perspective. Our training, for example, was incorporated by XPRIZE carbon removal. So any developer that's looking to apply for funding will need to take the course as a requirement. Yeah, I think that covered it enough, but happy to turn to you, Emily.
Yeah, some great questions, thank you. So just briefly on the Article 6 question, in a way, I think that if we knew what the rule book was going to be, this would be an easier question to answer, because I feel like I'm kind of fumbling in the dark a little bit to understand what Article 6 will actually look like. But, there's a clear risk here, which is that at the current time, most of the removals that are on offer globally are cheap and they are impermanent, right? And not only does this pose a risk of re-release of CO2, it also drags down the price, right? And so if you're in a situation where the price of a carbon credit is quite low because of all these land-based removals, this does two things, right? Firstly, it runs a risk of mitigation deterrence. So it means that rather than having these really expensive carbon removal credits, which then encourages companies to actually reduce their emissions rather than removing them, it kind of does the opposite. But another really important thing that I think we need to be aware of is what the public think carbon actually costs, right? So if you can go and you can buy some petrol, for example, and you can buy some credits to offset the carbon of this petrol, and it's costing you, $5 a ton, I think this creates an expectation that this is the price that we should be paying for carbon. And if we then turn around at some point in the future and we're like, oh no, actually it's $150 a tonne, really sorry, I think there's a real risk here in how we're actually going to have this conversation with the general public, right? And just briefly, Alex's question, just on the take on the various methods and their proneness to justice, we wrote a paper a while ago where we looked at all of the, where we were looking at ocean-based techniques for carbon removal, right? And our conclusion was that ocean ion fertilization has proven itself to be technologically not very feasible. It hasn't really worked very well, and it's also proven itself to be socially extremely problematic. And so we basically argued that it's time to stop focusing funding on ocean fertilization. It was the most controversial thing I've ever written. Like, honestly, all over Twitter, it was a complete nightmare. So that clearly didn't go down very well with a certain community of people. But, you know, there are techniques like this where I think we have to look at the information that exists and, as you were saying, think about at what point do we decide to stop pursuing funding in certain techniques.
Thanks, a great point. They're called ocean pasture restoration at the moment, isn't it? Something like that. Anyway, yeah, so on the Article 6 question as well, I mean, again, I'm also kind of fumbling in the dark, but my understanding of this is partly also that, so the idea with the Paris Agreement is that everybody moves towards net zero, right? And so if we take sustainability limits into account, we can agree that, you know, CDR is a limited resource, at least to some extent. Then, of course, if we kind of export CDR, Global South country export CDR, and the market is regulating that, and we're you know, prioritizing the lowest cost options, I think you get a situation where essentially, you know, these countries are exporting the kind of low-hanging fruits of carbon removal, which means they won't be able to use them themselves because it's the importers that will be using them towards their climate targets, right? In the long run, I think you run the risk that the Global South, which I would say has a more legitimate claim to residual emissions than much of the Global North has, will be unable to fulfill its own climate targets because it's exported the kind of low-hanging fruit, and it will have to either do more expensive CDR or have to import it at a higher cost, essentially, you know, creating another kind of justice dimension. So I think that's a problem that I see. On the alternative mechanisms, of course, this is a big question. I don't have a kind of ready alternative kind of lined up like that. But it all comes down, I think, to more regulation, more direct regulation. I mean, both for, you know, criteria that basically put justice front and center. At one end of it, I guess you have, yeah, I mean, some kind of more direct subsidy schemes. At the other end, you have maybe a public authority even that, you know, is kind of investing in CDR, or even, you know, organizing that in some way. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think we are coming towards the end of this panel, and in light of that, I'd just like to kind of summarize some of the key points that I'm hearing. Obviously, this conversation is just getting started. It's in its infancy, but given the fact that carbon removal there is some momentum at the technical level, we need to help the social and the ethical considerations catch up and be a foundational part. I will plug reading our recommendations and just contextualize that these are 5 recommendations for EU policymakers to start thinking about how to make justice provisions tangible within the fabric of carbon removal governance. This is the beginning of our thinking in this area as well, and we hope other NGOs will have the capacity to join us. I think that we've just heard a lot of different governance gaps that become evident when we look through the justice lens at carbon removal. What we now need to be thinking about is how to concretize and make tangible specific checkpoints for community engagement clear understanding of decision-making power, and this goes from the local to the global level. We've heard different examples of it gone wrong, it gone right, different policies around the world in response to that. So there is no shortage of our kind of thinking about how to approach this in the EU. And some things that we haven't discussed yet, but I think that that is because of the stage that we are at right now. The concepts of historical responsibility and what might carbon removal mean for the allocation of historical responsibility for emissions as well. So I'll kind of just float that as you all leave with the comments of our brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for attending.